an extraordinary ability for one who perhaps had a background that was much more difficult than we realised. So therefore, the ability to always see positive and move forward must have been built into his psyche. It must have been an incredible challenge to have to deal with.
The room had been prepared for an ordinary private family meeting. No cameras, no public announcement, no reason for anyone inside to expect history to move. Then Sophie entered, carrying a sealed envelope bearing Elizabeth's private mark, placed it before Princess Anne, and spoke words that changed the atmosphere instantly. The late Queen had left one final letter specifically for her daughter, and its instructions demanded that certain members of the royal family hear what came next. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Sophie did not sit. She kept one hand close to the envelope while Anne stared at the handwriting she knew instantly. The sealed letter, a private document preserved until its release conditions were met, had never passed through ordinary palace channels. Elizabeth had trusted the Duchess of Edinburgh with responsibilities, and that mattered because this message had been protected by loyalty, not bureaucracy. Anne pressed both palms against the table before reaching forward. The Princess Royal, the traditional title given to a monarch's eldest daughter, had faced duty with brutal steadiness for decades. But this was different. Her mother had chosen to speak after death, when no answer could be given back. Sophie told her that Elizabeth had ordered the letter released only when a specific family condition had been reached. Until then, she had been forbidden to reveal its existence. Charles watched his sister. The king understood that the envelope might carry more than affection. It could contain their mother's judgment about unfinished tensions inside the monarchy he now led. Sophie repeated the instruction exactly as preserved in a documented account after Elizabeth's death. The letter must remain sealed until the family reached the circumstance the Queen had anticipated. Anne broke the seal. Several handwritten pages emerged, followed by an instruction sheet. She read the first lines once, then again. Elizabeth wrote about duty, loyalty, and a decision her daughter might one day be forced to make. Charles shifted in his chair. Sophie watched Anne's face change as grief gave way to alarm. Then Anne stopped. She had reached a passage that seemed to explain why the letter had surfaced now. Her eyes lifted from the page and moved directly to Charles. Sophie understood before anyone spoke. Elizabeth had anticipated not only the crisis, but the people who would be sitting together when it arrived. Whatever the Queen had preserved inside that envelope was no sentimental farewell, and to understand why Anne suddenly looked toward Charles instead of continuing to read, they would have to confront the relationships Elizabeth understood better than anyone. 3 people now stood at the center of Elizabeth's final intervention, and each carried a different burden. Anne had spent a lifetime treating duty as something that required no applause. Charles inherited the crown, but also every unresolved fracture surrounding it. Sophie occupied a quieter position, trusted enough to protect a secret without demanding to know its ending. Yet the letter had deliberately brought all 3 together, forcing private loyalties into the same unforgiving room. Anne lowered the pages but did not release them. Her bond with Elizabeth had never depended on constant tenderness or public displays of affection. Mother and daughter understood one another through discipline, endurance, and work. The crown, the symbolic authority and responsibility carried by the reigning monarch, had taught them both that private emotion could never be allowed to overwhelm duty. That shared belief was exactly why the letter now felt so personal. Sophie watched her carefully. Elizabeth had trusted the Duchess of Edinburgh, a title given to the wife of the Duke of Edinburgh, because she knew how to remain close without turning access into influence. She could carry responsibility without making herself important. Now that quiet strength had placed her in the most uncomfortable position imaginable, holding a secret that had been deliberately kept from the future king. Anne finally looked up. "How long have you had this?" Sophie answered without hesitation. The envelope, she explained through the private documented account of Elizabeth's instructions, had remained locked away from the moment the Queen personally entrusted it to her. She had been told not to open it, not to discuss it, and not to warn anyone that it existed. Charles heard every word. Sophie could feel his attention sharpen, but she refused to apologize. She had not created the secrecy. She had obeyed it. Charles struggled with what that obedience meant. Elizabeth had trusted Sophie with something she had intentionally withheld from the son who would inherit her throne. He knew there could have been practical reasons for that decision, Yet the thought still cut deeply. Was his mother protecting the letter from interference, or protecting the monarchy from him? Anne returned to the pages. Her name appeared again and again, but not simply as a daughter being remembered with affection. Elizabeth described her as the person who might one day be required to defend a principle when others found compromise easier. Then came the line that changed Charles completely. Possessing the crown, the letter warned, was not always the same as protecting the institution. Charles understood the implication before Anne finished reading. Anne set the pages down and asked everyone else to leave. Sophie stayed. Charles stayed. The door closed, and 3 chairs remained occupied. Then Anne spoke quietly. They needed to discuss the incident Elizabeth believed would eventually force this letter into the open. That incident had not begun with the sealed envelope at all. Its roots lay in one private royal confrontation the Queen never forgot, and Anne never imagined her mother would preserve in writing. Years before the envelope was opened, Elizabeth had witnessed a moment that quietly altered her view of the monarchy's future. There had been no public scandal, no palace statement, and no constitutional crisis. Instead, the turning point came during a private conversation, when Anne challenged a decision the family had nearly accepted without resistance. Elizabeth said almost nothing at the time. But what happened afterward convinced the Queen that one person might eventually have to defend the institution from its own instincts. Anne had always occupied a difficult position inside the family. She was close enough to understand the pressures surrounding the sovereign, yet far enough from the direct line of succession to speak with unusual freedom. The line of succession, the order deciding who inherits the throne, meant she was not carrying the same future burden Charles had carried for decades. Elizabeth understood that difference, and over time, she began to see its value. The tension had sharpened during a closed family discussion at Windsor. A royal scheduling dispute had already irritated several senior figures when someone proposed quietly removing a long-serving palace advisor who had challenged a decision favored by more powerful members of the family. Anne immediately objected. She believed dismissing someone for giving difficult advice would send a dangerous message. Loyalty mattered more than honesty. Anne pushed her chair back and refused to support the dismissal. Elizabeth watched her daughter force the room into an uncomfortable silence. Later, in a private conversation preserved in a documented family account, the princess told her mother that loyalty to the crown could never mean remaining silent when the crown itself was being poorly advised. Elizabeth did not take the challenge gently. The Queen had spent a lifetime protecting discipline inside the institution, and her daughter's bluntness felt dangerously close to questioning the culture that held it together. Anne knew she had angered her mother. Still, she refused to withdraw the point. Hours later, Elizabeth summoned Anne again. The Queen had reconsidered. She admitted that her daughter had said what several others were too cautious to say. That admission became the seed of the sealed letter. Elizabeth began to believe the monarchy might someday require someone capable of telling a sovereign no, without wanting the sovereign's authority for themselves. Sophie later became the keeper because Elizabeth wanted the messenger to have no personal stake in the eventual dispute. The trusted confidant would deliver the words, not shape them. Then came the condition that changed everything. Elizabeth instructed that the letter should be released if Anne ever believed family loyalty was once again being placed above institutional duty. Now that condition had been met, and Anne could no longer treat her mother's words as history because Charles was sitting directly opposite her, waiting to discover whether Elizabeth's warning was aimed at the crown he now wore. Anne did not raise her voice. That made the confrontation worse. With Elizabeth's letter open between them, she looked directly at Charles and told him that their mother had anticipated a moment when affection, obligation, and monarchy would collide. Sophie remained beside them, carrying the uncomfortable knowledge that she had delivered the weapon now lying on the table. Charles listened, but when Anne reached the passage concerning the sovereign himself, restraint finally began to crack. Charles leaned forward and challenged the meaning immediately. The sovereign, the reigning monarch who carries the final constitutional responsibility of the crown, could not be supervised by siblings, private counsels, or family pressure. He told Anne that Elizabeth had understood that better than anyone. She agreed. Then she made the distinction that hurt him most. Their mother was not trying to control the king. She was giving her daughter permission to confront him when personal loyalty threatened institutional duty. Anne turned the letter toward Charles and placed one finger beside a handwritten passage. "Read it yourself." He did. The words warned that peace inside a family could become dangerous if it was purchased by avoiding decisions necessary to protect the monarchy's standards. Charles reached the final line, set the page down slowly, and refused to look at his sister. Charles felt wounded more than angry. Elizabeth had apparently imagined a future in which her son might need correcting, while trusting Anne to recognize the moment. The implication struck at something deeper than royal authority. It touched his confidence as a son, a brother, and the man who had spent most of his life preparing to inherit everything his mother carried. Anne refused to soften it. She told him Elizabeth's confidence was not some victory she could celebrate. It was a burden she had never asked to inherit. If anything, the letter had placed her in the worst possible position. Protecting the institution might require hurting the brother she had spent decades standing beside. Sophie finally spoke when the silence became unbearable. Through the documented instructions Elizabeth had left with the sealed message, she explained that the Queen never asked her to support Anne against Charles. She had been told only to make certain the princess did not face the decisive moment alone. That was why her name appeared in a second passage, directing Anne to seek her counsel before taking any irreversible step. Charles looked at Sophie, then back at his sister. His voice changed. "What irreversible step did she think you might have to take?" Anne turned to the final page. The answer lay there, and when she began reading, Elizabeth's message stopped sounding like advice and began to resemble a transfer of moral authority. The final page changed the balance of the room. Elizabeth had not given Anne constitutional power, nor attempted to create a rival center of monarchy. What she had done was subtler and perhaps more powerful. She had named her daughter as the family member who must speak when everyone else found silence more comfortable. The crown would remain with Charles, but Elizabeth had placed something different in Anne's hands. The moral authority to remind the sovereign when duty had begun bending around personal need. Charles rose without answering. The constitutional authority of the sovereign, the formal power and responsibility attached to the reigning monarch, still belonged entirely to him, and Anne could not command a decision. Yet the letter had changed the emotional weight of her objections. Elizabeth had turned what might once have sounded like family disagreement into a responsibility she had deliberately entrusted to her daughter. That distinction was impossible for the king to ignore. Charles walked away from the table and fell silent. Anne watched him carefully, and for the first time her certainty began to hurt. She could see the brother beneath the monarch, a son reading his dead mother's judgment about responsibilities he could never discuss with her again. Anne regretted the pain. She did not regret the warning. Sophie understood the danger immediately. She told Anne that Elizabeth's wish was never meant to humiliate Charles or create a weapon that could be used whenever disagreements became personal. Her role as mediator, someone trusted to keep a difficult conversation from collapsing into open hostility, existed for exactly that reason. Sophie reminded them both that the message demanded honesty, not punishment. Anne returned to the final instruction. Elizabeth had written one condition with unmistakable clarity. If her daughter ever invoked this warning, she had to name the decision she believed threatened royal duty. No vague criticism, no old resentment disguised as principle. If Anne challenged the sovereign, she had to say precisely why. Anne did. Charles had been considering a major internal concession designed to ease a continuing family dispute. The compromise promised temporary peace, but she believed it weakened standards Elizabeth had defended throughout her reign. To Anne, the danger was simple. Once duty became negotiable for the sake of avoiding conflict, every future exception would become easier. Charles turned back toward her. He told Anne the concession had not been finalized. Sophie immediately understood what that meant. For the first time, the sealed letter had altered a live decision rather than merely exposing an old fear. Charles agreed to reconsider, but there was a condition. He wanted Anne to explain, face to face, exactly why his compromise crossed Elizabeth's line. The letter had opened the door, but it could not make the decision for them. What happened next would depend on whether Charles saw Anne's intervention as loyalty or betrayal. By the time the private meeting ended, nobody had shouted, nobody had stormed publicly from the palace, and no announcement had been made. Yet the family structure had changed. Charles now knew his mother had prepared Anne to challenge him. Anne knew she could never again pretend the responsibility did not exist. And Sophie, who had guarded the secret faithfully, suddenly found herself standing between a king wounded by its contents and a princess determined to obey them. Charles acted first. Advisors waiting for approval on the proposed concession received a short instruction. The matter was being reconsidered. The authorization process, the internal steps used to turn a royal decision into formal action, stopped immediately. That pause mattered because once the compromise moved forward, reversing it would become far more difficult. For now, Elizabeth's letter had done something extraordinary. It had changed a decision without possessing any formal power at all. Charles returned to his private study alone. He removed his glasses, pushed the briefing papers aside, and left the copied passage from his mother untouched in front of him. Anger still burned beneath the silence. He was frustrated with Anne, but Elizabeth's foresight disturbed him more. The king now understood that his mother had imagined a future in which her son might need to hear resistance from someone he could never dismiss as merely an advisor. Anne carried a different pain. She withdrew with Sophie and admitted that she hated what the letter was doing to her brother. The princess could challenge Charles in public duty, but hurting him personally was something else entirely. Sophie listened before answering with uncomfortable calm. Elizabeth had chosen Anne precisely because confrontation would cost her something. A person who enjoyed opposing the monarch would never have been trusted with this responsibility. Sophie then revealed the final detail through the documented instructions Elizabeth had left with her. The Queen had revised the letter shortly before sealing it. She had added one handwritten sentence concerning Charles, and Sophie had been ordered not to disclose it until Anne had read everything else. Anne stopped breathing for a moment. The sentence was not an attack, it was a plea. Elizabeth had warned her daughter never to confuse challenging her brother with abandoning him. Anne sat down hard. For the first time since the envelope had been opened, determination collapsed into grief. The message changed everything, because it showed that Elizabeth had anticipated not only the conflict, but the emotional damage it might cause. Anne knew what she had to do next. She would speak to Charles again. No letter, no advisors, not even Sophie. Elizabeth had created the confrontation, but she had also left the path out of it, and Anne understood that the next conversation had to belong not to a king and princess, but to a brother and sister. The second conversation was nothing like the first. Elizabeth's letter remained elsewhere. Sophie did not attend. No aide waited inside the room. Charles and Anne met without institutional protection, stripped of the titles that had shaped nearly every argument of their adult lives. For several moments neither spoke. Then Anne told her brother the one thing she had been unable to say while their mother's handwriting lay between them. She had never wanted Elizabeth to give her this responsibility. Anne moved her chair beside Charles instead of sitting opposite him. She wanted no table, no document, no sense of opposing sides between them. The sovereign, the reigning monarch, carrying the crown's formal authority, was still her brother before he was anything else. She told him she did not see herself as a second ruler, a guardian of his judgment, or the owner of Elizabeth's legacy. The letter demanded honest counsel, nothing more. Charles finally admitted what had wounded him. His anger had never truly been about constitutional authority. It was personal. Their mother had trusted Anne with a warning about his future reign that he himself had never been allowed to hear directly. He had spent decades preparing to carry Elizabeth's burden, yet now he felt she had prepared someone else for the possibility that he might fail. Anne answered quietly. She repeated the final handwritten addition Sophie had disclosed. Challenging her brother must never become abandoning him. Charles said nothing for several seconds, but the words broke through something anger had protected. Charles then confessed why he had considered the disputed concession. He was tired. The continuing family conflict had drained everyone around him, and the compromise seemed like a chance to end years of tension. He wanted peace, even if peace required flexibility. Anne understood the exhaustion. She had seen what prolonged division could do to a family and to public confidence. But she warned that peace purchased by weakening standards would not remain peaceful for long. One exception would invite another. Eventually, the monarchy could lose the very principles it claimed to defend. Charles looked at his sister and revealed something through a private recorded family conversation he had never repeated before. Shortly before Elizabeth died, she had told him that a monarch must always keep people close who were prepared to disappoint him. The meaning landed instantly. Elizabeth had not chosen Anne over Charles. She had built a bridge between his authority and her candor. Charles made his decision. He would withdraw the concession in its current form and replace it with a stricter alternative that protected the principle Anne defended, while leaving room for reconciliation. Inside the palace, brother and sister had finally reached an understanding. But outside those walls, the existence of Elizabeth's sealed message was about to become a national obsession. The story escaped the palace without the letter itself. That distinction hardly mattered. Britain heard that Elizabeth had entrusted Sophie with a sealed message for Anne, that the letter had been released only after a private royal dispute, and that Charles subsequently reconsidered a major family decision. Within hours, the document became more than handwriting on paper. To some, it represented a mother's final intervention. To others, it revealed how profoundly the late Queen still shaped the monarchy she had left behind. Charles knew silence would not stop the questions. Palace communications, the official statements used to explain royal decisions to the public, confirmed only that a private family letter existed, and that its contents would remain confidential. That restraint mattered because the message had already influenced a live decision. Yet publishing it would turn a deeply personal exchange into a political weapon. Instead of ending speculation, the refusal made public interest explode. Anne watched the reaction with growing discomfort. Commentators divided almost immediately. Some treated Elizabeth's trust in her daughter as proof that she had always recognized Anne's blunt judgment as essential. Others questioned whether private family influence should ever shape the sovereign's choices. The princess disliked both versions because each reduced a painful family responsibility into a contest for power. Britain found its symbol by morning. A major London newspaper ran a stark front page showing Elizabeth beside Anne beneath the headline, "Her final word to Anne." Broadcasters held up copies while debating what the sealed message meant for continuity inside the monarchy. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered near the gates, where an elderly woman placed flowers beside a handwritten card carrying 3 words, "Duty still speaks." Sophie saw that image repeated across television coverage and felt deeply uneasy. The trusted confidant had preserved the letter because Elizabeth asked her to, not because she wanted history to remember her as its keeper. She had protected a promise in silence for years. Now her name had become inseparable from the most discussed royal message in the country. Anne reacted even more strongly when commentators described her as having won against Charles. Through a private documented conversation with family members, she insisted that there had been no victory. If the episode became a story about sister defeating brother, then Elizabeth's entire purpose had been misunderstood. Charles made the crucial choice. Rather than suppress discussion aggressively, he authorized a carefully worded acknowledgement, stating that honest counsel had always been part of royal service. The message validated Anne without weakening the king, proving their private reconciliation had survived public pressure. But one final decision remained. Anne still possessed Elizabeth's original pages. The world had turned the letter into a symbol, but where those pages went next would determine how this extraordinary episode finally ended. In the end, Anne understood that keeping the envelope beside her would misunderstand everything Elizabeth intended. The letter had never been created as a trophy, a weapon, or proof that one royal had been trusted more than another. It existed for a single moment of danger, when silence would have been easier than confrontation. That moment had passed. Charles had listened. Anne had spoken. Sophie had fulfilled her promise. And what remained was not unfinished conflict, but a final lesson about what loyalty actually demands. Anne made the final decision quietly. The original letter would enter the royal archives, the secure historical collection, where important monarchy records are preserved under restricted access, rather than remain in her private possession. That mattered, because Elizabeth's words had already completed their purpose. Keeping them close as a personal possession would risk turning responsibility into ownership, and the princess understood that her mother had never intended that. Sophie completed her part next. She returned the storage instructions and the accompanying sealed documentation, the written record confirming how the envelope had been protected and released. The trusted confidant had carried Elizabeth's secret for years, without using it for influence. Now she could finally step away from the burden, knowing she had obeyed the Queen exactly when obedience mattered most. Anne read the final paragraph one last time before surrendering the pages. She folded the letter carefully, returned it to the envelope, and rested her thumb briefly over her mother's handwriting. Grief still remained, but the anger had gone. Elizabeth had not trusted her daughter because she expected opposition to Charles. She had trusted Anne because loyalty sometimes required refusing the easier silence. Charles later spoke with his sister in a private recorded family conversation. The king did not thank Anne for challenging him. He thanked her for remaining beside him afterward. That distinction finally broke the resentment between them. Charles retained his authority, but he no longer treated honest resistance as disloyalty. Sophie quietly withdrew from the center of the story. She had guarded the letter, delivered it when the condition was met, protected the relationship around it, and asked for nothing in return. Her responsibility was finished. Charles then permanently abandoned the original concession and approved a stricter settlement, preserving the principle Elizabeth had feared might be weakened. No one had defeated anyone. The monarchy had corrected itself before personal loyalty became institutional weakness. Elizabeth's sealed letter accomplished exactly what she intended. It did not allow the past to rule the present. It reminded those carrying the monarchy forward that genuine loyalty is not obedience. Without question, it is the courage to protect one another, even when protection requires saying the words nobody wants to hear. When Anne finally surrendered the envelope, her mother's last instruction was no longer a secret waiting to explode. It had become a duty fulfilled. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.